When I was a bit smaller, a lot younger, and still had a fertile imagination, I loved masks. Plastic masks, wooden masks, paper masks, homemade or purchased, simple or intricate, it didn't matter. With each different mask, I could become a different person. With different masks, I could become whoever I needed to be. I could catch the bad guys. I could leap over tall buildings. I could swing on vines in the forest canopy. I could fly. And like the movie Mask with Jim Carrey, when I was behind the mask, I could hide my insecurity. I could disguise any weakness. You see, I could be who I really wasn't, or so I thought. I could do what I really couldn't, or so I thought. Are we wearing any masks today? Paul was a follower of the holy man Jesus. His reflections on the experience of God as expressed through Jesus have been the basis for much of what people understand as Christianity. Some of his writings have been used over the millennia to spiritually set people free, and some of the writings have been misused to disenfranchise people. Whatever your understanding of Paul and the way Christianity has been used or abused through his writings, Paul knew about the way people wore masks to hide their true selves. He was writing to the church at Thessalonica, reminding them that what he had shared with them in the rest of the world was as real as it got. And he would not hide behind a mask when he shared his understanding of God. He learned that from Jesus. Right after Jesus told a story about a young man who finally decided to take off his mask and return home. Right after Jesus told a story about faithfulness and honesty, the Pharisees laughed. It wasn't the laughter of joy at a new truth learned or the laughter one shares with colleagues. It was the laughter of derision. The laughter of those who were themselves hiding behind masks. Jesus said to them, "You're the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your heart. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight." The Pharisees were often the foils in the encounters with Jesus. They came off as unwelcoming, stuck in traditions that excluded all but the most pious. The Pharisees were portrayed as holier-than-thous, hiding behind masks of hypocrisy. But of course, for us to focus on their foibles means that we are still peering out from the safety of our own masks. Are you ready to take off your masks today? Let's explore God's understanding of who we are. Not the way the world sees us, but as God created us. Let's pull off the masks and get honest with who we are. In all reality, God already knows even the deepest secrets, fears, and insecurity of our hearts. So it seems to me that we can be honest with ourselves and others, at least here in this sanctuary, where God is supposed to be. As the psalmist wrote, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." Before masks even existed, we find in Genesis that we were created in God's image. And yet, from the beginning, we began to hide our holiness from others. Metaphorically, we began to hide by covering our nakedness behind the artist's conception of a mask for the body, the fig leaf. The stories of hiding behind masks continue throughout our faith history. Cain in his anger, Esau as he steals a blessing, David as he seeks another's wife, Moses when he tells God that he can't lead the people of Israel, Elijah as he hides in a cave, the Samaritan woman at the well who failed to look at her relationships, the bleeding woman who tried to hide in the crowd, Peter who denied he knew Jesus, Paul who did the things he didn't want to do. God knew the failures. God knew the weaknesses. And God knew the hypocrisy of each person that I just mentioned. But God also knew what was behind their masks and continued to work through them. This also means that God knows the failures, the weaknesses, and the hypocrisy we each live with, and will continue to work through us. God sees behind the superficial masks we show to the world and looks right through to them, to the real person behind the mask. And yet, knowing the real person, God still loves and accepts us. So how do I know that? Well, because as Paul suggests, the masks come off when you allow God to work through you, and the truth of God's love then comes out regardless of how the world would stop the truth. And I know that because I'm not alone in that understanding of God. The Apostle John writes, "This then is how we know that we belong to the truth, and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence whenever our hearts condemn us. For God is greater than our hearts and knows everything." The Apostle Paul writes, "In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit intercedes for us with groans that words cannot express." We don't need to hide behind masks because God gives us the heart and the strength to be ourselves and share the image in which we were created. The image of sacredness in which we were created. In fact, Jesus invites us through his word to the Pharisees to take off our masks. Paul implores us through his word to the church at Thessalonica to take off our masks. And I would suggest that all that is truly holy entreats us to take off our masks, to share our sacred essence with each other. God knows our hearts and wants us to take off our masks, to be honest with ourselves and each other as we live through our faith. One of the very basics of being spiritually healthy, of being in healthy relationships, is to be honest with who we are and whose we are. That means removing our masks intended to hide our true selves. That means removing masks that cause us to be less than authentic. That means letting the world see the real person behind the mask, the real person that God delights in. And just in case you haven't yet grasped the good news this morning, God is delighted in the real you. not the masked version. God is delighted in you. Unmask yourself and celebrate the holiness that is you.